Thank you all for joining. I'd like to welcome you to the annual lecture of the Biodiversity Network, Bending the Curve on Biodiversity by Michael Obersteiner, who has newly been appointed Director of the Environmental Change Institute. I'll just give you a couple of words about the Biodiversity Network. The Oxford Biodiversity Network is a network of researchers and practitioners in and around the University of Oxford working on biodiversity. It extends over more than 20 departments and institutes and supports over more than 200 members. In general, we work on highlighting and integrating the range of biodiversity-related research and activities going on in and around Oxford. And we work closely with other Oxford networks for the environment, collectively called the One Network, that includes energy, water, food security, climate change, and biodiversity. We mobilize the university's expertise in science, technology, business, and society in relation to the environment to work on the One Network. So I just wanted to highlight that if you'd like to receive news about the network's activity, please mail us on biodiversity@ouc.ox.ac.uk. We'll put that in the chat. If you'd like to ask questions during the talk, please do so in the chat, and I will invite you to ask your question directly to Michael when the talk is over. And we will be joined by Professor Andrew Balmford, Dr. Mike Barrett, Professor Natalie Seddon, and Professor Sir Charles Godfrey after the talk for a panel discussion. I'll now let Yadvinder introduce the talk and Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Michael Obersteiner. And of all the things the Biodiversity Network covers, there's probably no more important question in biodiversity than what do we do about the ongoing decline in biodiversity, and how can we reverse that decline? And this is a question that we know is complex. We know it involves understanding how we consume planet's resources, and it also involves understanding how we protect the biodiversity on the planet. And it's quite hard conceptually to bring those ideas together in a single framework. We know our individual behavior matters. We know protecting biodiverse areas of the world matter. And I think what Michael and his team have managed to do is really bring all of those ideas together in a single quantitative framework, which is what will be the focus of this lecture today. And it's this real quantitative spanning of all of these concepts. There's such an important contribution that Michael and his co-authors have made to our field. So Michael joins Oxford as the new director of the Environmental Change Institute, and he joins us from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, where he was Director of Ecosystem Services and Management. And he reminds me he's a fourth generation forester. His own research experience stretches from biophysical modeling in ecosystems, forestry and agriculture, through to economics, finance, and integrated assessment. And his background also includes diverse studies in the fields of terrestrial ecosystems and economics. He completed his graduate studies both in Austria, at Boku University and at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Vienna, and also at Columbia University in New York, and in the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk. So it brings a very geographically dispersed perspective as well to our understanding. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Michael, and over to you.
Thank you, Yadvinder. And thank you for the kind invitation to talk today. I was choosing the topic Bending the Curve on Biodiversity with the subtitle How to Heal Biodiversity and Feed the World. And in a way, this is very topical for this super year on the environment, where we have the climate COP in Glasgow with a very strong component on nature-based solutions. Natalie will, I guess, talk quite a bit about this. At the same time, by the end of the year, we will also have the COP for the CBD, for the biodiversity negotiations in Kunming in China. And we also will have this year the Food System Summit, where we also will be a discussion on how to more responsibly feed the world. So before going into the nuts and bolts of bending the curve on biodiversity, let me just go into the issue of how important the nature sector overall is. We all think that we are, as modern societies, mostly dominated by an economy that is more an economy which is more dominated by the service sector. However, just recently, there was a study by the World Economic Forum where they calculated that 50% is actually nature-based GDP. So here you count in not only the agricultural sector or the food system sector, but also mining, forestry, and others. Also, another interesting figure is, and here France, but this is not unlike to the UK, if you take different system boundaries, typically the agricultural sector has 1-2% of GDP. However, if you take the entire food system into account, a country like France calculates up to 36%. So here, what I would like to say is that if we want to regulate and get more biodiversity out, we actually have to transform fundamentally the entire economy. And it's not only the economy, but and part of the economy is also employment. So definitely just purely the agricultural sector is responsible for about 1 billion jobs. And if you take the associated household members into account, the livelihood of about 2.5 billion people depend directly purely on one sector, and that's the agricultural sector, which is the largest driver of biodiversity destruction. But there are, and this is quite important if we talk about bending the curve, there are lots of issues associated with a sector like the agricultural sector. So 65% of the working poor depend on agriculture as a livelihood. And if you intervene with new policies that give us more biodiversity, we have to take these factors into account. And then we have issues like child labor and so forth. And you all know what we are talking about here. But then also on the environment, just purely the AFOLU sector. So that's the jargon in the climate groups. It's agriculture, forestry, and land use is responsible, according to IPCC, for about 23% of total greenhouse gases. And if you take again the lens of a food system, then it's up to 37. So here the trucks that transport groceries and so forth, if you take those into account, then it's much higher. But also there's a huge benefit nature gives to us, and this is the natural ecosystem sequester about 11 gigatons CO2 per year, which is 1/3 of fossil fuel emissions. So in a way, a lot of benefits are created for free in order to still mitigate climate change as we live today. However, these benefits might go away if we have substantial Earth system feedbacks and ecosystems cannot no longer absorb so much CO2. And then finally, the nature, the economic sector, agriculture, forestry, mining, and other activities are the largest drivers of biodiversity decline. And when we just look at this famous diagram on the planetary boundaries, we actually see biodiversity is apart from nitrogen and phosphorus, the one boundary that we already exceeded. When you look further into other publications, and here I dig out again the World Economic Forum, they identified biodiversity loss as one of the most likely and most impactful threats to the health of the global economy. And this was actually published before the COVID crisis, where we now know that these links between biodiversity and ecosystem intactness, how they can systematically impact the health of the global economy. So here, I guess there's a lot of motivation to do something about biodiversity decline. However, at the same time, we do have an appreciation of the issues that we have to fundamentally change how we operate our economies and even how we live. Before I go into bending the curve on biodiversity, there were already concepts of bending, so to say, already around in the forest transitions literature, where scholars described forest decline. Basically, when you look at the left-hand figure, from an intact forest to a locked-over forest to a secondary agroforestry system, transitioning for some time into crops and grasslands, and then later on you might get back some restoration. The same curves for forest cover only were also done where people populated, and that's on the right-hand figure, actually look at different countries as they go along these forest transition curve, where you have a high forest country like Central Africa, which has still lots of intact forests, all the way to countries like Costa Rica, who went through in the past decades major restoration activities in order to secure some of their vital ecosystem services which they lost. The forest transition curves is also and was strongly linked to what economic colleagues call the environmental Kuznets curve, which basically tells you that there is a U-shaped relationship between GDP and, in this case, forest cover. This is a theoretical proposal, and on country level data, it's not so clear how to show this. And we published recently a paper where we just looked at country border deforestation phenomena, because here you can compare alike to alike, where you have the same biophysical conditions and it's more of a controlled experiment, and took these estimates and stuck them into an economic model, and we could actually confirm that such a forest transition curves is actually existing, and that GDP is actually a very good predictor of deforestation and later recovery. However, there are lots of issues related to this, because some of the recovery can only be supported by generous imports from other countries. So there's a lot of indirect land use changes involved in this. However, there is the theory that the richer we get, nature might come back by itself. However, and this is one of the main motivations of bending the curve, is why should we go through this dip? Can't we go more directly towards a better state of the environment? And so what we did, also partly motivated by the issue that the CBD negotiations just about 2 years ago were still and are still struggling to formulate an equivalent target as the 1.5 or 2 degree target that was formulated for the climate negotiations, to find something that could also speak to biodiversity, something that is simple enough but still summarizes the overall complexity of the issue. And here we collaborated quite strongly with WWF, and Mike Barrett we might talk some later about the overall process. And we collected about 58 authors from all over the world, spread over 41 institutions, in order to calculate in a multi-model fashion bending the curve on biodiversity. And so what did we do? So we first looked at what are the drivers that could enable biodiversity recovery. So what we looked at food system drivers, we looked at changing diets more towards a planetary health diet, more motivated out of the health literature, but also generating quite significant environmental benefits. We looked at food loss and waste reduction. We looked at trade, and in this case, we'll come back to that later. Trade is actually an enabling factor rather than a devil, so to say. And one of the main drivers, and we'll go into more detail, is actually the role of more high-yielding agriculture in order to spare more land for restoration and conservation activities. And then on the other side, we looked at, I call it landscape actions, assumptions on major restoration globally. And we enforced in the modeling conservation areas way beyond what we see today. What we did is we did a scenario experiment where we actually modeled out the increases in yields, increases in trades, waste reduction, the drivers I was just talking about. And once and we ran these drivers individually, but also in a portfolio. And the results I will talk about will only present the results on the integrated action portfolio, where we put all of those actions together into one scenario. What we did is we ran classically integrated assessment models where we had scenarios on population development up to 2100, assumptions on a base diet and continuation of current diets, but also the planetary health diet, and the other variants on production yields in agriculture and so forth. We stick these into these global land use models, and which are listed below. I don't have time to go into them. Maybe we could talk about it then in the discussion. And what we get out are basically land use change maps projected out to 2100 in 10-year time steps for about 12 land use classes. And then these dynamic maps out of these integrated assessment models were then used by biodiversity models in order to calculate the impact on specific biodiversity indicators. And here we looked at changes in habitats and suitability for habitat suitability and size. We looked at intactness of ecosystems. We looked at population dynamics of mostly animals, reptiles, birds, mammals, amphibians. But we also invested quite a bit into looking also at plants, which is not so common to look at on the global level. And then we looked at regional extinction and global extinction. What are the results that we got? So first we ran a kind of continued global trends analysis without any ambitious additional actions. And here you see basically a continuation or even an acceleration of historical trends with respect to the decline in biodiversity. So here we looked again, I read it out, extent of suitable habitats, and you always see the percent difference of the indicator measured against the 2010 variable reading. Then we have an assessment of wildlife population density, local composition intactness, regional extinctions, and global extinctions. And consistently across all of the different models, both on the integrated assessment sides, producing these land use maps, and then the biodiversity impact models, we see this continued bleak picture. However, when we run now this integrated action portfolio, we see that for quite many indicators, and here you have the same indicators discussed before again, you see that almost immediately we get a response. So though typically we know that biodiversity indicators, they take quite some time to respond, a quite substantial improvement, and we get this bending of the curve on biodiversity indicators. So what the basic message is here is that yes, we can. However, if only all the wedges are simultaneously deployed, so if we really have the conservation activities, the restoration activities all together with all of the, I would call it, depressurizing food system levers, food loss and waste reduction, diet shifts, and so forth. If we get those working together, then we get these quite transformative results. But then there is the other assumption that we start immediately. There is no time to spare, not to get into action. And one issue which typically is overlooked is here we have the assumption that all countries actually do collaborate. And one issue of collaboration I would like to shortly discuss is international financial transfers, because what you see is that, and this is some complementary work by Bernardo Strasburg, when you look at global priority areas of restoration, for example, you have low priority in our geographies in UK or Western Central Europe. However, the red spots of very high priority, they are actually in the south. And so here collaboration between countries would mean that in our geographies, we do on a relative scale less, but transfer financial means and also technology to the south in order to protect and, in this case, restore vital ecosystems in the south that yield more biodiversity per unit action, so to say. So that's one form of global collaboration, similar to trade, actually. So, however, what we see in these global models, they are typically quite constrained. So that the dynamics are actually hindered by certain assumptions of social feasibility or simply calibrated with historical values. So the question now is also, what could in principle we do? Could we actually do more than what was published in this Bending the Curve paper? And so the question is, can we actually get more, so to say, and can we get more in shorter time, and particularly also see whether we can avoid this dip? Do we really need to go through this dip? And here we need to see what these individual levels of change could actually give us in principle, not constrained. So if we were in a non-constrained world. So what we recently did was a study where we just looked more in the kind of technocratic side of agriculture and see whether we could get more out of land sparing from agriculture. So the basic question we ask ourselves was, what if we produced crops with the best available technology everywhere on Earth? What would happen? And we were doing bets before how much, in this case, land we could actually spare. And we actually got it wrong. The numbers came out actually more stronger than we anticipated. So in a nutshell, what we did, without going into the very details of it, we looked at agriculture today and how crops are actually produced everywhere on Earth. And we took a biophysically crop growth model and gave it all it needed, so to say, sufficient water, sufficient nutrients and so forth in order to close the yield gap. And then we ran an optimization algorithm in two scenarios. One was maximum land sparing and the other one was, we called it targeted land sparing. Just to give you an illustration how this looks like, so the maximum land sparing scenario is you have, in this case, quite highly mechanized, highly sophisticated, high yielding agriculture, and you only produce at locations, global locations, which give you the highest yield, so the best global locations, and you give up agricultural production on the rest of current production sites. The other one is a targeted land sparing, and here I just take an illustrative example from Italy, where on the left picture you see an intensively cultivated farmland, rice actually, in 2006, and they converted it and restored it into something that is that they know out of the literature corresponded to historical agricultural landscapes pattern in the Po River Valley. And this is the realized reality in 2018, what you see here. So, what they did is they basically came up with about 10% of land going more into historical landscape elements like hedgerows, woody alleys, and so forth. So it was only 10% in our targeted land sparing assumptions. We actually forced the model to do at least 20% of these landscape elements. And so the results, to our own surprise, were quite significant. So what we found was that we only need half of global cropland to replicate the entire production we produce. I think in this case it was 2016, to replicate what the world produced in that year. And if we go into this targeted land sparing, the difference was actually not so large. So here we talk about 40% land sparing if we introduce these additional landscape elements. And we also looked at some of the other environmental impacts. So apart from the lower land requirement of about 40 to 50%, we also looked at, we were quite curious about the other planetary boundary, which I mentioned already, nitrogen. Here we could actually see that it's about roughly the same kind of nitrogen that would be spilled. Of course, you have more nitrogen application per hectare and might include more local pollution. However, since you spare so many hectares, overall the nitrogen requirement is about the same or reduced, depending on how much you assume you use crop residues and the incorporated nutrients to actually go more into a a circular economy kind of concept. What was also quite interesting was that in the Landsparing, we actually got much less irrigation water use requirements. In the targeted Landsparing results, you see we see overall a little less fertilizer. However, there seems to be a little bit of a coupling with increased water requirements, but still also quite significant irrigation water requirement reduction. So now we find Landsparing is actually a very effective and probably also technologically quite easy lever we could embark on. However, the literature, especially on the integrated assessment models, they all come out with a result that once you start to change agricultural practice, it's always costly, and therefore we have a trade-off with food prices. And here what I plot is this comes out of our work in data, an Oxford product. We actually see historically this decoupling of wages in manufacturing and the price of food commodities. However, if according to general wisdom, we would through Landsparing increase these prices, then we might actually face problems with in developing countries with food security and hunger, and in more developed economies, of course, also the working poor would disproportionately be suffering, because here you actually have not the point estimate, but you have a distribution of hourly wages. However, when we look at a bottom-up engineering approach of cost accounting, and this is a study which is unfortunately not yet published, but I show you the results anyhow, what we see is that the global total cost of production would also be reduced a little less than what we see on the Landsparing outcomes. So here what we understand now is that the costs the costs per hectare to produce in a Landsparing fashion is actually a little higher. This is why farmers don't pick it up. However, the total cost, the overall cost is much lower because you have less hectares to multiply with. And in kind of the insight here is it would be much better to target, for example, subsidy payments on the basis of environmental impact per nutritional value produced on a hectare of land. Vis-a-vis what we see today, where you get flat payments for just owning the land, so to say. So here we just looked into the issue of one little lever, and this was the application of best agricultural technology applied everywhere on Earth, and we see this enormous benefit, which gives us the insight that this little green arrow now, that we could just simply with this lever, we could actually improve quite a lot. But we could also go not only into the healthy diets, which we assumed in bending the curve, we could even, in a theoretical exercise, go to a full vegan diet. And what was not assessed yet in any of these scenarios, go more into new kind of technologies. One technology I personally like quite a lot is producing algae in the desert with salt water, and use some of the algae for human feed, but probably also for some fish feed or even livestock feed. So if we would put all of these things together, we could actually be even more ambitious if we wanted to. Just saying that there's a lot of potential out there to spare more land overall. So what does this mean? In one sense is if we on top of the kind of theoretical benchmark of 50% land sparing, this technological push, if we combine this with improved diets, we get an additional third less of land requirement. However, here we would have to address the behavior of billions of people, and today we are 7.8 people, and there's the question of how many people will actually react to this. Secondly is we will have to incentivize many farmers, and probably the number of farmers still operating in such a scenario would be about 250 million of farmers who would generate substantial cost saving. However, how do you get so many farmers to react to policy signals? And here we would have to deal, of course, with their local biophysical realities, but also social and even behavioral heterogeneity. And to overcome the knowledge gaps and ambition lack of ambition, there's a huge challenge on lack of data, information, knowledge, capacity, and even capital. In order to operationalize these kind of larger visions, we would also have to innovate on the governance. And here with the newer technologies, which we are using in most of the OECD countries anyhow, we use micro-targeting, micro-incentivizing, where you actually get in the value of particular ecosystem services much more precise for the local conditions and compensate for those, rather than blanket payments for particular agricultural measures, which might actually not even deliver any meaningful environmental benefit. And one issue, if we were to go into this direction, is actually related to policy transition risks. And here is how can we get governments to commit to give very strong and clear signals to producers that the world is actually going to change and that there is more security for investment. And then finally, again, which is also typically ignored in many of the global studies, is what's the role of new technologies that actually might radically change the entire game. I just mentioned the algae as a illustrative example. However, I present it now in a very, simplistic way, a paradigm of land sparing. However, there are very different development paradigms around. And one thing which is quite prominent and actually became quite prominent in the UK, because a similar study is done here for all of Europe, was done for the UK, where you have a concept of agroecology, and I put this down in bold letters here, where agroecology looks at abandoning pesticides, synthetic fertilizer, and redeploying large amounts of grasslands and introducing landscape infrastructure. So landscape infrastructures could also play in a land sparing scenario as well. And what's quite interesting here is that these propositions are also looking at diet shifts. So overall, of course, they subscribe to less meat in the diet. However, since a lot of nutrient recycling is enabled through grazing animals, they actually favor the consumption of red meat rather than white meat, while in the more land-sparing scenarios, you see the recommendation that red meat is bad for the environment. So interestingly, the agricultural production insights play very much also in the recommendation what you should eat responsibly as a global citizen. The agroecology community is also quite strong on the issue of labor and more rural labor, which others might actually dispute, and I'll go into that in a second. And then they also, if you just come up with an image of the desirable landscape and how it looks like, it's very different from a land-sparing landscape. So one issue, I guess, which in the bending the curve we did not really look at yet is really what are the big trade-offs? And here the big trade-offs I kind of identify at the moment is really the trade-off with rural jobs. Because what we see in the land-sparing scenario, due to the fact that we will see much more mechanization and one tractor can substitute 40 agricultural laborers in a region like I look here at this figure in South Asia. So what we see overall in kind of as a business as usual development is that here the share of agriculture and employment is continuously decreasing over time. So these are lines drawn from data from 1970 to 2007. And on the x-axis, you see the share of agriculture in value added. So what you see is we all gravitate towards the paradigm of agriculture in the OECD, however, at very different speeds and in very different patterns. So here, the MENA region is actually decreasing and decreased its employment share quite significantly. And this is also part of the reason people say that the depopulation of rural areas going into cities where the absorptive capacity for jobs was not that large, that some of the Arab Spring issues came up basically through this long-term development of agricultural productivity improvement, I would say. Whereas in Southeast Asia and East Asia, what you see there is that the value of agriculture in the total economy was decreasing quite significantly and quite fast. However, employment didn't change. So this means that in these geographies, rural labor basically got devalued, and the income of agricultural activities decreased quite significantly. So this is a clearly rural underdevelopment trap those geographies go into. And so if the world would go very quickly in a land-sparing scenario towards an OECD paradigm, we can estimate that about 2 billion livelihoods would have to change quite significantly. And this would be in the interest of environment, so to say. And that's huge numbers, and probably tells us immediately that there are significant barriers to implementation just because of labor market issues. So what the mental map behind the technology-driven land-sparing paradigm is and this is a caricature I'm putting up here now, is that the farming sector is typically traditional, backward. We have low productivity, and with low productivity, we have associated quite significant poverty. People are uneducated because they don't have the means and the capital to educate. So there's a permanence of unskilledness. You have unorganized and informal markets. While in many countries, we actually had a pull in terms of labor demands into the modern economy, which lives off capital accumulation, where you need skilled labor and so forth, and you have a more organized and formal way of interaction of people. So the solution historically has been we try to give more labor to the non-farm sector, and we try to give more technology and inputs to increase agricultural productivity to the farming sector. However, in many geographies, we looked at Eastern Asia and Southern Asia, so India and so forth, the non-farm sectors might not have the same absorptive capacity as we have seen in many of the OECD countries. So we have to see whether these paradigms really work out. And this mental map you see in many different literatures, ranging, I put here, agricultural economics, development economics, new structural economics, and neoclassical growth theory. We're all singing this very similar song. The question is, I think, in principle, there's a lot of wisdom to this. However, the question in the context of bending the curve is this actually feasible, and at what speed? And will this speed be fast enough to spare enough land for nature? One silver lining, which we hear nowadays quite a lot, is that the nature-based solutions can actually become the new job growth engine to absorb some of the liberated employment. However, the question is there really enough absorptive capacity for 2 billion people to be employed by a new upcoming nature-based solution economic sector? And that's something people start to work out now. First results are, yes, there is some, however, it will not square up to those 2 billion, which have to be absorbed by some other economic sectors. So now, very quickly going through conclusions from what I would call an oversimplified talk. I know word is more complex. However, it's nice to distill this into more typical archetypes, so to say, and landsparing, land sharing, for example. And what we learned now is that the technical potential, even of business as usual technologies in agriculture, is enormous. And basically, there are no excuses not to deploy those for the sake of securing some of the planetary boundaries which we depend on. There are many compromises to be struck. My hypothesis at the moment is that social feasibility of the bending the curve on biodiversity is actually one of the most interesting ones to look at. And those are both in OECD countries, but even in developing countries. And in OECD countries, we probably see it more in terms of political feasibility, because you don't want to see tractors with angry farmers driving into capital cities, while in developing countries, real livelihoods are affected. But what we also see is that from this more land-sparing paradigm, we also see enormous synergies, especially between biodiversity and carbon, but also on water. And if we were to deploy more efficient fertilization technologies, we could also do quite a lot on the remaining exceeded planetary boundary on nitrogen and phosphorus. What's also quite important, and this we'll probably be able to discuss in the discussion then, is the implementation of bending the curve, especially restoration, rewilding, will actually have to be done on an unusual, at least from a political point of view, implementation entity, which is more a landscape rather than a jurisdiction. And we will have to learn how to do this better in the future. One thing I observe more and more is that there's a very strong role for science-based approaches, especially in concrete landscapes, and data-driven local discovery, where actually local stakeholders, through data collection together with science, actually find the sweet spots of the development in their concrete landscapes. That's something that needs to become much more of a tradition rather than, you know, top-down plans on transforming entire landscapes. And finally, and then I'll stop, is in order to do the bending the curve, we discussed the issue of international transfers. One means of international transfers are new financial instruments for a nascent nature-based economy. And here there are first steps the community is doing, but we will need more brains, and hopefully in the discussion we'll get some thoughts on this, on how to innovate better to make these many thousands of global landscape projects actually be implemented in a sustainable way. With this, I'll give back to, I guess, Cécile. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for this great talk. And we've got lots of questions coming in, so we'll be addressing these. First, I'd like to invite our panel to the table. We have Professor Andrew Bamford, who is Professor of Conservation Science in the University of Cambridge, where he runs the Conservation Science Group. Dr. Mike Barrett is here. He is the Executive Director of Science and Conservation for WWF UK. Professor Natalie Seddon, who is Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Oxford's Zoology Department and Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. And Professor Sir Charles Godfrey, who is Professor of Population Biology at the University of Oxford Zoology Department and Director of the Oxford Martin School and Director of the Oxford Programme for the Future of Foods. So I'll ask you each a question, and I will start with Andrew. Following Michael's talk, I'm wondering how you reconcile these global scale findings with the work you've been carrying out at the local scale. So you've been investigating land sharing versus land sparing approaches at the finer scale, and how do you see this increase in food production with least impact on biodiversity happening at the local scale?
Thanks very much, Cécile, and thanks, Mikhail. I hugely enjoyed that talk. So I think our work that we've been doing at local scale really echoes many of the points that Mikhail was making there. The situation is very serious. We know that at local scales as well as on those global traces. But where we're heading is not inevitable. We have choices. And the actions that we might take there for biodiversity, for instance, have the potential to have substantial co-benefits for other concerns, particularly carbon, but others as well. But looking at it from a local perspective, we come to the same conclusion that they're going to require concerted actions across different sectors. Conservation is not going to sort this out without concomitant action particularly in the agricultural sector, but in the health sectors and so on and so forth. And so what we've been doing locally, just to explain that very briefly, is we've had teams of people going out over the past 15 years to evaluate the sensitivity of individual species of plants and animals. Now we've looked at more than 2,000 species, one by one by one, looking at how their populations respond to changes in management practices, from being intact habitat through to low yielding, perhaps thought of as potentially wildlife friendly farming, right through to the highest yielding systems of the sort that Mikhail was characterizing there. Using that to estimate what would be the least bad way of meeting food demand at any given level in terms of those species. Would it be through land sharing or through land sparing or something in between the two? And what we found consistently across 8 different regions now, very different farming systems, very different groups of organisms, consistently most species would do least badly under a land sparing approach. We get the same results through for carbon as well. But that result then raises the challenges that were then flagged by Mikhail's analysis. The kind of 3 things I think that came out of that. One was that if we're going to make space for creatures and carbon on the landscape, we're going to have to couple conservation policies with those around food systems. Conservation will not succeed if it's not a joint endeavor with food production systems in particular. Second, that the nature of the technologies that are involved to boost yields are going to be key. They're going to need to be locally tailored. They don't necessarily have to be industrial agriculture. They can be all sorts of different approaches that are tailored to smallholders and so forth, but they need to be evaluated against a whole series of environmental metrics around pollution and water use and so on. And last, I think the point that came through time and again in Mikhail's first set of analyses and is in the paper very clearly, that whatever we can do on the demand side is also going to be very important alongside those supply side measures. So what we can do about shifting diets or limiting the shift in diets towards Western style diets, and certainly excessive meat consumption among richer people, and what we can do about food waste. All of those things will buy us more space and more time for trying to deliver these really quite complicated trajectories that Mikhail was outlining. Thanks, Cecile.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll share the papers you've been working on and mentioning on this in the chat. And next, I was wondering, Charles, back to the global scale, what would you say this means for the resilience of global food supply?
Thanks, Cecile. And Mikhail, I really enjoyed that talk. And I think what your work shows, also the work of Andy Bamford and other people, as well, is that there is the potential out there to feed a population of 9 to 10 billion people without wrecking the environment if we take some of these hard decisions. I think what I particularly liked about your talk is that you squarely address what I think we in the environmental community often overlook, and that is the political economy and economic issues around the livelihoods, the vast number of people who actually base their livelihoods on food production in one form or another. And you can look at it in a simple way and say, well, 2 billion people depend directly, indirectly on food production. So we must at all costs keep those people on the land. But then we have to remember that the vast majority of those people, although their livelihoods depend on food production, those are pretty rubbish livelihoods. And if you look what happened in the rich world, then we reduced the number of people in agriculture to increase the total factor productivity, the productivity of that. And we did that in the 18th and 19th century by essentially throwing people off the land, many of them into destitution, some being mopped up by the Industrial Revolution. So what really struck me from listening to your talk is all these issues around the environment and food need to be situated within broader discussions about economics and development economics. So how do we do this? And it's a fascinating time in development economics with many different ideas out there, but we don't yet know how to do it. And there are people who are pessimistic, saying that there are institutional problems that are stopping it. There are other people who say we just need to invest in whatever it is, medium-sized towns and in the developing world. And again, I just think it's this issue of, if we're interested in the environment and food, where do we draw the system boundaries? And again, you brought up when you were talking about that economics 101, and many arguments suggest it would make a lot of sense for food to be more expensive, and in particular for the more environmentally damaging food to be more expensive. But that would then affect the poorest section of rich societies and many poorer societies. So I really like that, the way you brought in economics. And finally, I'd just like to repeat what Andrew said at the end of his bit. We don't have the luxury to just concentrate on consumption or production or waste or governance. We just have to do the most we can on all these fronts simultaneously.
Thank you, Charles. All the wedges. And I'll pass on to Natalie next. As Charles says, there are many solutions available, and you've been reviewing hundreds of nature-based solutions activities from across the globe. I was wondering if you could give us some good examples of nature-based solutions for better land management that increase food security and provide the multiple benefits to biodiversity and human well-being.
Thanks very much for the question, Cecile, and thank you also for a real tour de force of a presentation. That was fantastic. Thank you, Mikhail. It's going to be great when you can join us physically in Oxford. There's lots of great work that we can all do together on this topic. Yeah, when it comes to nature-based solutions, which we need to be reminded of community-led, biodiversity-based interventions in nature, there is actually an enormous amount that needs to be done in working lands, sort of reflecting on, in terms of carbon sequestration, some of the biggest benefits of are to be found in the 4 billion hectares of working lands that there are out there. And I think, you know, when it comes to nature-based agriculture, broadly speaking, you know, they involve many techniques. Many of them are traditional techniques, as was referred to, that integrate ecological processes and build resilience in the ecosystem as well as in the food system. And in the Northern Hemisphere, yes, we might think of practices such as conservation tillage and field margins and connectivity of ecosystems across the agricultural landscape, and all have been shown in certain situations to improve security in different ways. But I think most of the inspiration in this space comes from the global South, from whom, you know, those parts of the world that have been interacting with nature to buffer them against the effects of environmental variability for millennia. We have much to learn, and there are, you know, a very long list of possible examples that I could provide and that we could learn from. But the two I wanted to highlight very briefly now is one that's been fairly well researched and is fairly global in extent, or at least across the tropics, and that's agroforestry or agroecological techniques, which have been mentioned a couple of times, both in the talk and also I noticed in the chat as well, people highlighting these community-led indigenous practices around agroforestry. And then a less well-known one of floating agriculture, which has its origins in Bangladesh, but which is definitely starting to go to scale across the country and beyond, in a very valuable nature-based agricultural technique in an increasingly flooded environmental space. Certainly we know that there is certainly growing body of evidence that agroforestry, which put simply is growing crops among trees and trees among crops, can sustain, if not enhance, yields, especially in dry and more variable climates, through all the different more ecosystem services that can be provided by trees, providing that they're the right types of tree species planted in the right places, including enhanced soil facility, reduced crop stress, reduced soil erosion, and so forth, regulation of water supply. And there is also growing evidence that agroforestry can increase crop resilience to climate extremes, whether that's droughts, or higher temperatures, because it enhances water infiltration and so forth. Also sequesters carbon, provides habitat or connectivity among habitats for biodiversity, and so forth. And there's a specific example of very successful and actually a profitable agroforestry project comes from the borders of Gola rainforest in Sierra Leone, although there are fantastic examples from all over the tropics. So there was a project there that was initiated around 30 years ago, and that was a partnership involving 140,000 local farmers working together with the national government, with BirdLife International and RSPB and the Conservation Society of Sierra Leone. And the interesting thing there is the project was initially established for conservation, for biodiversity conservation goals, but it has since massively improved local livelihoods, and the avoided deforestation has not only protected biodiversity, but saved an estimated 500,000 tonnes of carbon a year. So that's very much a community-led, biodiversity-based project that provides economic benefits to local people and provides resilience for the ecosystem as well as the people that are dependent upon it. And I know that there's a lot of good work out there bringing together that evidence that agroforestry can be extremely useful, and we might want to think about deploying that more broadly. The other example, which I won't speak about at any length, is floating agriculture, which developed in the south central wetlands of Bangladesh, but which is a way of allowing farmers to maintain or increase nutritional and financial security in the face of increased monsoon seasonal flooding. And although that's yet to be studied in terms of its benefits for carbon and biodiversity, it's certainly extremely powerful in terms of supporting human adaptation to climate change. So I'll leave it there. Those are my examples. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Nat. The floating agriculture always makes me dream. It's such an innovative project. So next, I was wondering, Mike, if you could tell us what this means, this analysis means in practice. How does it apply to the real world changes we need to see coming out of the couple of landmark international negotiations that will be taking place in 2021?
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. And yeah, thanks also to Mikhail. It's fantastic to hear that the presentation on the bending the curve research and much more as well. And this is such important work. So what should we take from this in this year particularly? So this is a huge year of international decision making. The range of UN meetings that we've got coming up, the CBD, the climate COP. We've also got the UN Food Security Summit. So the whole range of opportunities, meetings, and the UK's got the presidency of the G7 as well. There's so many things happening this year, which means that there's huge scope for change if we get things right. And crucially, what the bending the curve work has shown is that it is possible to do much more than simply slow the loss of nature, slow the loss of biodiversity. And it feels odd that we should even have to say that, but it's an important point to make. Because if we go back and look at what was agreed in Nagoya at CBD COP in 2010, that actually is where it ended up. If you look at CBD Aichi Target 5, it talks about slowing the rate of loss. I mean, to slow the rate of loss when you've lost too much already, if that's the sum total of ambition, then we're in a pretty bad place. And at this point, I have to hold my hand up and make my guilty confession, which is that back in those days, I was a government negotiator. I was in Nagoya. I was part of the EU delegation. I helped negotiate Aichi Target 5, and I regret deeply now where that ended up. It was nowhere near enough. But what this research shows is that we can do better. It is possible, and not only is it possible to halt the loss of nature and to reverse that loss, it's also possible to do it while still feeding a growing global population, and that's a crucial finding. It also shows that it could be possible. At the most optimistic end of the scenarios that we model, it could be possible to actually reach that inflection point by the end of this decade. That's hugely ambitious, and it would take a remarkable effort to achieve that, but it is possible. And I think, bearing in mind that the jeopardy that we face, we have to aim for that highest level of ambition. That is what we should aim for. We've got to aim high. We've got to aim to bend that curve by 2030. So that's where all these international meetings should be committing to get to during the course of this year. But other crucial things that come from the research, and this again may sound like a slightly odd thing to say when I'm here representing a conservation NGO, but what we learn from this is that conservation alone will not deliver this. Conservation alone is not going to bend the curve, it's not going to recover nature at a global level. It simply cannot ever be enough. What we have to do is to drive the system change. Without the system change, we don't get to where we need to be, and particularly in the food and agriculture sector. And it's so interesting to see the food and agriculture sector is the sweet spot between the recovery of nature, the avoidance of dangerous climate change, and the underpinning of future human development through food security. This is the sweet spot. This is where the action really needs to be. And I guess the way I'd sort of describe the solutions that we've got to get towards this year is a set of cogs in a machine. And the cogs that I would include in that would be what you might describe as the removal of bad finance, so unsustainable, environmentally harmful subsidies in agriculture, but also the finance through venture capital, pension funds that actually allows land speculation and helps fuel land grabbing and habitat conversion. We have to remove that bad finance from the system. We've got to generate demand for what you might call good produce, sustainable agricultural produce, and that could be work through international and domestic supply chains, partly driven by consumer demand, partly through the right commitments from the retail sector. But one thing we have learned over the last years is that voluntary commitments are never going to be enough either. And the retail sector and the traders, I think themselves, are very clear about this. You have to have legislation. Unfortunately, the UK government is actually in a good place on this. We have a proposition for a due diligence obligation to start to get deforesting commodities out of the supply chains into the UK, and that's a great start. Government needs to follow through on that, but that's a really crucial part of the jigsaw. And then, of course, there is a provision of finance. So switching from unsustainably productive landscapes into sustainably productive landscapes and shifting agricultural production away from deforestation fronts and onto abandoned or degraded lands, that does come with an upfront cost, and that cost needs to be met. And I think it's only reasonable, actually, that the international community bears a large share of those costs. And this is where I think that the finance flows from nature-based solutions become really interesting. I think there is a risk that there is an oversimplistic view of what that finance might mean. Finance for traditional conservation. It doesn't have to be that way. This could be a source of finance that helps catalyze that transition. That would be really game-changing. Now, so there's a whole range of cogs, a whole sort of range of parts of the machine. And the crucial thing, as Michael summed it up, I think, really nicely in his presentation, he said all the wedges have to happen together. That's exactly right. All those cogs have got to be in the machine together, moving at the same time. Otherwise, we don't get to where we need to be. We don't get to bend the curve. So that is crucial. And again, perhaps I shouldn't have to say that, but I think it is worth reiterating because we've got to learn from experience. So the current set of internationally agreed targets, the Aichi targets for biodiversity, at their heart, they really did sort of aim at a very simplistic level. It was essentially a deal around mobilizing international finance for countries to take on targets to protect more area of land and sea. And what's happened since then? So we've seen the area of terrestrial protection increase from I think 10% at the start of the decade to about 15%. We've seen marine protection increase from about 3% to 7%. We've seen a doubling of the flows of international finance for biodiversity. So a degree of achievement against the Aichi targets, and yet every single measure of the health of the planet, every single indicator of biodiversity is still heading the wrong way fast. So that tells us that model doesn't work. So if we ended up in a position this year where our political leaders ended up sort of focusing on the lower hanging fruits, more protected areas, more cash for conservation, it shouldn't be too much of a leap to then realize that way lies madness, because clearly we know that alone doesn't work. So you have got to have all these parts of the cog acting together. And I guess the last thing I would say is also just the sense of objective, sense of urgency. There's no time to just sort of do this in a piecemeal way. It has to be all together now. Just look at what's happening in the Amazon. So we're a few percentage points away from potentially reaching a tipping point where the whole biome starts to shift towards being a savanna landscape. Now, apart from the tragedies of the natural world, there is no plausible way that we stay in a 1.5 or even 2 degree world if you've lost the Amazon rainforest. Nobody has modeled a scenario that doesn't have a functioning Amazon rainforest. We're that close to getting this right in this year of all years, and learning from the research that Mikhail has just described is just absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. We have a lot of questions coming in from the participants. I'm wondering if the best way, I'm going to ask our participants to ask their questions directly, and most of them are directed at Mikhail. But please, our panelists, please do chip in if you feel like you'd would like to answer these questions. So I'll start with Alex Morel. Can you please ask your question?
Oh, hello, can you hear me? Okay, hi, everyone, thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. It was music to my ears on lots of things. Just like anecdotally, I've spoken to farmers that are very keen to have their goods valued for their nutritional value. And we're also working with farmers in Ghana to work on the science base, collecting data and getting community-led engagement at landscape level. So really cool. But so my question was kind of a bit practical because I did come a bit late with the capacity of the room being increased. So I was just wondering around the your modeling of extending or maybe concentrating the geographic areas of that would be idealized for certain crops or certain food production. And I was just curious if have you taken into account sort of variability in climate change and maybe certain regions that might be more prone, because there's some concern. There's a lot of inefficiency in how like the distribution of agriculture for sure, but that kind of allows for some redundancy. And I know for some particularly important international crops, the fact that wheat is produced across 2 different hemispheres and several continents makes it a much more reliable source of food in case certain regions get hit by a climate or other disruption at a certain time of year. Ditto for rice when there was a massive upheaval, cyclones in Asia that did impact the trade of rice, and certain countries were sort of loath to trade what rice they did have. So I mean, there's this obviously much more levels of complexity, but I was curious if you had considered that in your modeling.
No, this we did not do this yet. However, I personally led a research initiative looking at multiple breadbasket failure, and that's I think exactly going into this direction where we do scenarios. What would happen if in multiple concentrated breadbaskets we would actually see failures because of some climate weather teleconnection. Then of course, if you take that into account, you would actually see more of a geographic spread of production. And in a way, we also see that the difference between the maximum land sparing and the more targeted land sparing, where you actually see more of a geographic spread of production, is the difference is not that big. So here, in a way, a field down in Brazil and I don't know, in Iowa, they can actually have the same function, and it doesn't matter whether you spare this one or that one from a pure agricultural point of view. However, it might make a huge difference from a biodiversity point of view, and then you can make this easy exchange. But that's research ongoing. However, to do better work on this, we would need better climate models on these multiple breadbasket failure inputs to do a proper assessment. And we see, for example, in Brazil, we see the soy fronts going exactly into a region where you see much more hazard for drought coming in, which in the end is not good for the producers themselves, but for the entire production system overall. It should not be in the interest. And these are quite sensitive ecosystems at the same time. So it doesn't make, on any account, it doesn't make much sense what's happening at the moment. And these are these intervention points where it's so obvious what should be done.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Next, I'll invite Alexandre Chausson.
Thank you very much for your talk, Michael. It's really eye-opening, and these analyses provide room for optimism, I think. I just had a comment which I wanted to share with you, and I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts. So it's about the environmental Kuznets curve, which you showed, and as I understand it, it's been used by economists to justify continued growth. And I think it's closely tied, excuse me, to this notion of decoupling, which you hear a lot about in policy circles. So this whole talk about green growth, and the analyses that show this relationship, as I think you pointed out briefly, don't account for the fact that the richer the country gets, in terms of GDP at least, the more it outsources environmental degradation to poor countries. So there's a paper that I read by Haeckel and Callis, which looks at historical trends in resource use and various models, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but it concludes there's no empirical evidence of decoupling, at least under a background of economic growth as we know it. And this occurs even in economies that are predominantly service-based. So I'm just mentioning this because I think, well, I want to learn more about it, and I want to hear your thoughts. And I think it's important to bending the curve globally, at least. And Mike made the point that it was really important to get it right this year. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah. On the environmental Kuznets curve, I only showed the relation to the forest transition curve, and there is a lot of decoupling, as you mentioned. There's a lot of literature out there, and the evidence. So here, just concretely to the paper which we produced, here we looked at cross-border deforestation phenomena, and basically, we see that the Kuznets curve is confirmed. However, exactly as you said, and as I mentioned also, it doesn't say how the country does it. Is it doing it through better diets? Is it doing just through import substitution? Is it doing it in other ways? So here, what would be required would be a second stage of analysis to actually explain how countries actually come to their decoupling. However, from this is satellite observations, there is this truth, so to say, from Earth or from outer space that we observe that richer countries can afford better landscapes, so to say, or maintain some of their landscapes. And engage in recovery. Again, the question is, if you were to do it in a consumption-based accounting, if you take then the indirect land use effects into account, then then we know that their land footprint is actually much larger than the boundary of their own nation, and so it's in a way it depends on how you put up the accounting.
Okay, thanks.
Could I invite someone else from the panel to answer this question?
I'm quite happy to say something. No, I was going to say, I think that I agree with the framing of the question entirely. And just the observation that, well, two things. I think the environmental Kuznets curve was originally conceived of in terms of air quality, which you can imagine over the short term is potentially reversible, whereas the loss of old growth forests is not. And I think that's a miss in that sense. Even if you were to find the relationship, taking into account external forest consumption and in trade, but it still wouldn't mean that it was necessarily an environmental Kuznets curve for biodiversity as opposed to trees. And then the other was just to say, I think the Haeckel and the Callis paper that you refer to, that's the most scary paper I read last year. I tend to be an optimist, and it's the one that really had me rather worried.
Thanks, Andrew. Next, we have a question from Sarah Cordoves.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the talk. As a young person, it is very helpful, and yeah, it brings a lot of hope to know that all of these tools are being developed, that then my generation is going to hopefully be able to implement, although I don't think that's the timeline that should happen. This should happen within the next 10 at least. But yeah, my question was around the issue of conservation, and I wanted to specifically ask whether the ECI was having the important conversation about how do we make sure that conservation transitions from fortress conservation into indigenous and local-led conservation as quickly as possible, seeing how this model largely relies on conservation, how do we make sure that we are not exacerbating a lot of the issues that we're talking about here when, yeah, the complete denial of indigenous land tenure leads to deforestation, leads to biodiversity loss, and it's sort of a cascade effect of when we don't understand that humans are part of nature, what happens to the models that we create and the implementation that we drive. I've left a lot of resources about that in the chat as well. And I would also, the second question that I asked was about sort of the role of finance, of that transfer of finance that you talked about from the global north into the global south, and to also, yeah, maybe ask whether the lessons that are coming from development studies about the role of finance and the role of top-down technocratic approaches as actually exacerbating vulnerability in places like where I am and where I'm from, like Colombia. So yeah, those are my two questions, sort of how do we move conservation in a way that is actually effective and that actually serves our purpose and our needs, what we're talking about here, and how do we take lessons from development studies in such an ambitious plan? Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. So let me start with the finance and probably pass on the indigenous issue to Natalie. I guess you have the best overview there. On the finance, first of all, one observation is the finance we will need and the financial instruments that are going to be invented to make the bending the curve. They will probably have no real precedence of what we have seen. So, of course, we need to learn lessons from what good and bad we did up to now in terms of top-down, as you said, top-down finances. And just today I had a conversation with someone working on global supply chains and deforestation and biodiversity issues from UNDP. And he mentioned that they are also trying to reinvent themselves in order to better cater for what we all agree upon now is that this is really a major transition. So this is not something we did in the past with more incremental and actually rather little money, although we heard from Mike that biodiversity spending was even doubling, but here we talk orders of magnitude larger transfers, and the way how we will have to deliver those must be much more in a co-creation mode than we did in the past. And I think currently this will not fly with civil society anymore. I have a hard time to see this, even in countries which are used more to top-down policy making. So and one thing is to broker a landscape deal. This is in a way different than, you know, building a classical infrastructure, which development finance did in the past, where you could simply take land away and make all sorts of things. To broker a landscape deal that actually is sustainable in the sense that you can conserve the natural capital you put in, you need to win the hearts of the people, otherwise this won't fly. And since it's so much of a, and what came out in the discussion already and from the talk, so many things need to be coordinated. If people are not part of this, even massive amounts of finance will not make it happen. So here, I guess we will have to be more innovative and also experimental on how to deliver these best. And there are examples from concrete landscape projects where we know that this actually worked, and probably we can at some other time go into the details of some of those. But there are not many good examples yet. And maybe on the indigenous issues, Natalie, can you respond?
Yes, of course. I mean, I don't think, I don't know of anyone either on the research side or the practice side who is thinking about fortress conservation even if they might have considered it in the long distant past. I think we know that not only is it irresponsible and deeply unethical to ignore resource, ecological and cultural rights of local communities and indigenous peoples, but any interventions involving those natural resources, involving the ecosystems on which those people depend is doomed to failure, because there's an awful lot of important knowledge in those communities about how to work with those ecosystems. And also there's huge pushback, as we know from experience and some of the challenges around RED and other initiatives in the past. We know that there can be huge pushback against these initiatives that might have been implemented with the best intentions, but unless they are, you know, implemented with by and for local communities, then they won't be sustainable. And I think we're moving away, and have long moved away from this sort of separation of people from nature, or where certainly the nature-based solution context is about people in landscapes, people and nature working together in landscapes. And obviously this varies. This is obviously very locally specific, and it varies in different parts of the world to the extent to the relative importance of these different issues. But certainly, no, there's no conversation that, you know, that it is going to reinforce that fortress conservation problem that you so clearly articulated. So thank you for the question. It's a very important one.
Thank you, Natalie. And could I ask Mike to also answer?
Yeah, thanks. And again, Sarah, thank you for the question. It is a really, really important one, an important issue. First of all, I completely agree with Natalie in that. I mean, I think quite apart from the morality of this, that the science is so clear that the best way to continue to protect land is to allow the local communities and indigenous peoples who have lived there for generations to continue to steward that land. That's absolutely clear. But I think that the shift, looking at it from a kind of a UK perspective, the shift I think we do need to make in our conservation thinking is to consider why it is that in many parts of the world those local communities are under pressure. And if we take it as an example, what's happening in the Brazilian Amazon at the moment, people are under pressure primarily because land grabbing is going on. Why is that happening? It's going on because land is being grabbed for conversion to agricultural productivity. Why can that happen? It can happen because there's a market for it, and who's buying the products? It's us. So, thinking about the best conservation intervention we can make, we can stop buying that stuff. We've got to take our footprint off these areas of land to enable people to remain on their land and keep stealing it. Of course, there's other work we can do in the short term as well. We provide drones and other technology, for example, to some of the communities to help them monitor what's going on. But ultimately, that's the kind of that's the sticking plaster. It's the system change that's necessary. We've really got to think about our role in the world and how we're helping drive the loss of lands that local communities, indigenous peoples have in other parts of the world. And that to me is the big conservation intervention that we can make from here.
Thanks, Mike. I'd like to thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation, and to our panel for pertinent responses. I'd like to hand over to Yadvinder Mali for a few final words, and thank you all again for this evening.
Yeah, thank you, Cecile. Thank you for hosting this so well, Cecile, so smoothly. And thank you to all the panelists and to Mikhail as well. And I think what this last hour and a half showed is that there is no more important question in biodiversity. How can we halt the ongoing decline and do it in a timely way, in a scalable way that is both ethical, locally embedded, but also works at this large scale? I think this is the question that we've been trying to tackle in the last hour and a half. It's clearly an opportunity. There is a chance to just see the whole pathway differently. And I think this bending the curve, just as a conceptual framework, has really changed the way people have been thinking about the ongoing degradation of the world. But there is a huge number of challenges, and we've touched on some of those challenges here as well, and the importance of dealing with some of these on the short time scales that we have, including the big opportunities this year that Mike mentioned. So I hope forums such as these, this network, can be a place where academics like those here and practice policy can get together and think through the nitty-gritty of how to push this forward and contribute to this larger effort. I'd like to just finally mention that this has been recorded and we'll post it on the Biodiversity Network YouTube channel. We had a few issues right at the start on capacity issues and managed to sort that out after 5-10 minutes. So if any of your colleagues were unable to get in, please point them towards the, apologies for that, and please point them towards the YouTube recording that'll be available on the Biodiversity Network. So thank you everyone for participating. Thank you to the panel and the speaker and the chair for an excellent session, and good evening.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, good evening.